Today we have three speakers. First, Dr. Monique Moultrie from our department will provide an opening statement. Dr. Moultrie specializes in Christian ethics and teaches about issues of religion, race, and sexuality. Following her statement, we have two guest speakers, Dr. Sylvester Johnson of Northwestern University and Georgia Representative Scott Holcomb. I will be asking a question or two of each speaker. Then the speakers and myself will have a brief dialogue, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the audience. I myself am not a disinterested party in this conversation, given that today's environment parallels the America that my Japanese American ancestors encountered in the early 1900s. And in recent weeks, in fact, the last 2 weeks, there have been shootings and other hate crimes directed at Asian Americans. So, and with that, I'm excited for today, so let's get started with Professor Moultrie.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I was asked to offer opening comments to frame the discussion this afternoon regarding our theme, our chosen theme of religion, race, and reconciliation. As I reflected on today's purpose, I found myself consumed by history. In my introductory world religion courses, I've spent the last 2 weeks walking students through the history of various immigrant exclusion policies that the U.S. enacted to keep out certain groups from our national borders under the guise of providing national security, which is how I've been teaching about the presence and absence of the different flavors of Buddhism and Judaism in the United States. I remind my often millennial generation students that these conversations do not occur in a historical vacuum. For example, as early as the 1900s, sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the question of how far differences of race, which show themselves chiefly in the color of skin and the texture of hair, will hereafter be made the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing to their utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. Sadly, these words, and arguably, sadly, these words still ring true, as the continuing problem of this new century appears to continue to be the color line. Many Americans still have polarized views of racial relations, and these views are often intricately connected to persons' religious beliefs. Arguably, religion has served to imprint morality onto racial groups. Religious myths about race are important markers for determining social hierarchies. Myths are authoritative and meant to teach us something. Socio-religious myths provide an answer for why the world is the way that it is. In spite of data that shows us that there is more genetic variety in one race than the different racial groups, and notwithstanding the fact that 99.9% of human genetic characteristics are common to all people, the myth of race lingers, partially because it is deemed by many to have religious sanctioning. Myths remain so pervasive because they are often based on storytelling, and the use of myth is especially significant in religious stories. According to religious historian Bruce Lincoln, myths are encoded with the fundamental values of a group, such that storytelling is actually just a reflection of the values and persona of the storyteller. Thus, it is important to recognize the power involved in religious myths because some groups are given authority to shape stories that then become fact. An African proverb states, "Until the lions have their own storyteller, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." Using critical race analysis in religious studies requires listening for the story of the lion and questioning the tale of the hunter. One could argue that this is also the task of our conversation across polarizing lines. However, this is the work not just of those from marginalized perspectives. Politics is one arena where these contesting identities and perspectives are waged, and often this means hearing from views that are not like one's own. In President Obama's last public address to the nation, he asserted that politics is a battle of ideas, and we must venture out of our ideological bubbles to make compromise possible. In President Trump's first public address to the nation, he reminded us that we are one people with one destiny, made by the same God, here to fulfill the vision of American greatness, which only we can achieve together. Both national leaders push us to points of reconciliation, and I'm encouraged at the goal of being called to carefully listen to various sides, understanding that lives and livelihoods are at stake. In our conversation today, both of our panelists will lead us into a discussion of the ways beyond these tensions created from within our religious, racial, and political identities, and I look forward to what they have to share.
Thank you, Dr. Moultrie. Many of the themes that she mentioned will be coming out today, so very exciting there. And now for our guest speakers. What I'm going to do is introduce one and ask them one or two pointed questions, and then we'll come together. All right, so first we have Dr. Sylvester Johnson. Whoa, this is hot mic. First we have Dr. Sylvester Johnson, who researches the history of empire in the Americas and other nations on the Atlantic. In particular, he examines how colonialism shaped modernity and the increasing role of the national security paradigm in shaping the relationship between religion and the state. He is the sole author of two books, African American Religions, 1500 to 2000, Colonialism, Democracy, and Freedom, and the second book, The Myth of Ham in 19th Century American Christianity, Race, Heathens, and the People of God. And he has recently co-edited the book, The FBI and Religion, Faith and National Security Before and After 9/11. He is currently producing a digital scholarly edition of an early history of global religions, researching human enhancement through intelligent machines, and developing a machine learning application for humanities research. All right, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson. Thing in front of me, but is it still working? All right, great. So I just wanted to see you while I asked you a question. Okay, so Dr. Johnson, for my first question, I hope you can provide us with a larger historical perspective on the current moment. Now, briefly, can you describe one or two ways that African American religion has been shaped by colonial enterprises and thought?
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks for the kind introduction and for the generous invitation to join this conversation. I think it's a very important one. Unfortunately, it's a very timely one. And given the recent and ongoing developments in our nation and our world, but I think it's prudent to bring together people to think very seriously about some of these larger issues, and I love the format of a conversation as well, and so I look forward to hearing more from all of you. I think there are very prominent ways in which the history of African American religions have intersected with and been shaped by practices of empire, colonialism, that really speak to some of the current issues. So one of the things that I've tried to emphasize in my own work is the way that colonialism has generated what we now call race. We are probably more familiar with thinking about the history of race by thinking about slavery. But race is actually something that's global. And slavery itself, as we are accustomed to learning about it in relationship to African Americans, was happening inside of a larger superstructure. And that larger superstructure was a global empire, it was global colonialism. And I like to try to summarize my approach to colonialism this way by pointing to attempts to dominate populations by subjecting them to a state power when they're not able to belong to that state, to be recognized as having a pristine relationship with it, even though they're subjected to its authority. We know that for many centuries, for example, in Western Europe, Jews and Muslims were subjected to rule by Christian princes, while also being treated as people who could never be trusted to belong to the society. Even if they were required to convert to Christianity, after they converted, they were still treated as suspicious people who could not be trusted. And that led to very violent histories of exterminating their populations, forcing them to leave different Western states. We can think about current realities throughout Western Europe today, where Muslims, despite constituting only 7% of the population, in France, for instance, are over 75% of the prison population, not because they have some criminal nature, but because they are hyper-surveilled and targeted. And we all should be able to appreciate the gravity of the history of Jews' treatment throughout Europe and the culmination of anti-Semitism, as many historians have shaped that by tracing the history of the Jewish Holocaust. To this day, Muslims are still treated as outsiders. Anti-Semitism continues as an ongoing reality. Even the Roma, people who are of Europe, are not treated as belonging to Europe. But that's actually a result of colonial relationships where you dominate people, treat them as outsiders, they're subjected to the state, and they're treated as if they're not able to have a pristine relationship to it. Well, that actually happened to black people as well. And we're used to thinking about slavery, but it happened inside of this other thing called colonialism. And so as peoples from Africa were brought to the Americas, they were still treated as dominated people who are here, they exist, even if they were free, even if they were not enslaved, but they don't actually really belong. Right? So that's some of the longer, deeper history of empire, what empires do, of how colonialism has operated, and how we need to be able to appreciate not just its practice as a system of dominating people, but its capacity to create what we call race. And as I said, I've tried to explain that as a way of dividing up people so that some of them can belong to the society. They are treated as being insiders, and others, it doesn't matter how long they've been there, it doesn't matter where they were born, it doesn't matter how hard they work, they're always treated as people who can't belong, even if at a later time something shifts, and maybe they are treated later as if they belong. So what that gets to is some of what Professor Moultrie was pointing to earlier, that this notion that race is in the body, it's about our bodies or biology, has been shown to be a fiction. But that doesn't mean that race is not an actual social force, that it's not a social reality. It still continues to operate. But how does that impact more recent histories and more recent realities, particularly with relationship to religion? I've written about the process whereby over many decades, national security practices have targeted Muslims in this countries as people who are not allowed to belong. It's treated as if they're always someone who can't be trusted to be part of the United States. And if we think about some of the recent developments in national security practices, both before and after 9/11, as my co-editor Steve Weitzman and I tried to show in the book that came out last month, The FBI and Religion, we can understand, unfortunately and sadly enough, that some of these recent developments have a history. They have a prequel, an American prequel, that goes back several decades. And to summarize it, the prequel is that before the Hart-Celler Act, which changed the immigration quota system in the 1960s, most of the United States Muslims were overwhelmingly black. And they were targeted not just because they were black, but because of their Muslim practices, which questioned racism, which quite forthrightly resisted it and opposed it, which are very anti-colonial. And they were targeted as enemies of the state. It's unfortunate to say, but it's true, that since at least as early as the 1930s, these African American Muslim communities have been surveilled and infiltrated by our federal government and treated as people who were a threat to national security, and that has never ended. And so as America's Muslim populations have become more racially and ethnically diverse because of the changes in immigration reform since the 1960s, it has unfortunately remained the case that Islam has continued to be infiltrated, surveilled, and regarded as a threat, as something that challenges the interests of the United States. The early history of that is the history of Muslims who are overwhelmingly black. The contemporary reality of that is much more racially diverse, but unfortunately it is still beleaguered and shaped by some of the same national security sentiment and presumptions about particular populations, about what's being defined as the interest of our nation, and whether or not those two things fit together.
So if I could touch a little on the theme, our theme of reconciliation, can we move forward a little bit into, well, I think you covered a lot of the time there, but can you provide us with maybe, let's see, maybe fill out this national security paradigm a little more for the audience, as well as the FBI's role in that paradigm. And how has African American religious groups or other groups that you've looked at been challenged by government surveillance and have been able to find reconciliation amongst themselves?
So the question and the attention toward the FBI particularly is very important. The FBI is probably the most well-known national security entity. It's not the only one. There are 16 national security entities in the United States that have been created over several decades. And national security practices, since at least the certainly about the mid-20th century, since probably the early 20th century, became standard for nation states. They had not always existed in that way, that is, national security entities. So the National Security Act of 1947 made permanent the predecessor of the CIA, for instance, and it became just as important to have national security institutions as it was to have a military or to have currency in order to have your nation state. So that's a new development from the 20th century that we should appreciate. And these national security practices perform important roles and functions. I don't want to suggest that there is no such thing as any kind of need to have national security protocols or to perform intelligence activities to ensure the security of populations. Of course those things are necessary. They're vitally important. The problems emerge when people who are in the society are actually coming into jeopardy in the name of national security and because of those practices. And so in looking at the history of the FBI's engagement with African American Muslims and with American Muslims more broadly, it becomes very clear that this has been a persistent problem that is actually jeopardizing people's rights, violating civil liberties, by claiming that it's necessary to do so in order to defend the nation, when the nation itself is already constituted by people whose rights are being violated in the name of that activity. So to give one example, in 1955, the FBI created a training manual. Well, let me back up a little bit. In the 1930s, the FBI first began infiltrating an African American Muslim community known as the Moorish Science Temple, according to the FBI's own records, because they believed in racial equality. Like, that was taken by the FBI as a sign that they were mentally unstable. And so FBI agents, and you have to recognize at the time the FBI's official, the United States was an apartheid society. So from the top down, apartheid was not a Southern institution. It was a federal, national institution. The U.S. military, which is not a Southern organization, it's a federal organization, was operating on apartheid, racial segregation. So it was the position of the FBI that the whites are a superior race. And if there are people who are claiming that's not true, clearly something is wrong with them. So by their own account, at that time in the 1930s, they said these people must be mentally unstable. They're fanatical. Fast forward to the 1950s, other things were going on. So some of these Muslims were claiming that they should not have to fight on behalf of a government that was a racist government. So they didn't want to be forced to join the military and to be sent overseas, probably to kill other non-white peoples, in the name of a nation that was targeting them as people who did not have the right to have rights. And that also then became another reason to suppress their movements. In 1955, the FBI created a training manual to prepare its agents, field agents, to surveil and to repress and to destroy American Muslim communities, because they knew that most FBI agents were not familiar with Islam. that they didn't have an understanding of the religion, that they weren't really clear about what people were talking about if they were covertly joining these organizations by posing as Muslims, that they needed to be able to understand what was going on. And that training manual had pretty substantially troubling material in it. For instance, it claimed that the true religion of black Muslims was actually a religion of anti-white hatred that they had inherited from their black ancestors, and that they were falsely claiming that racism was preventing blacks and whites from being equal. And the FBI claimed that the real reason that whites had more money, had better jobs than blacks was because they were a superior race, and that these blacks were cultivating racial hatred against whites by claiming that they needed to do something to change the order of society. And that mantra of the FBI became common knowledge. So today, people who know nothing about the Nation of Islam, for example, can tell you that they teach hatred against white people. And they may not realize why they think that, but they actually think that because the FBI created that narrative. So fast forward to 2009, and it came to light that at least as early as 2009, the FBI was once again conducting workshops and using training manuals to prepare their field agents to surveil, infiltrate, and to repress American Muslims who were posing a threat to the nation. This is 2009. This was just a few years ago. And that training material said things such as the following: that it is the nature of the Arab mind. So they're reading Islam as Arab, even though those are not necessarily the same things. But the nature of the Arab mind is to commit violence. That people who follow the Bible and Torah have inherited a long history of civilizational capacity to be nonviolent. This is the FBI's claim in the training material, because the Christian Bible, the Jewish Torah, is rooted in nonviolent civilization, but that Islam, which is based on the Quran, never progressed to that point. And so Muslims are stuck in this civilizational nature that is a violent type of nature that has not progressed to the point of nonviolence. They had charts and everything to show the gap between Muslims and Christians and Jews. This was 2009, that it was the nature of the Arab mind to actually be misled and swayed to violence, and that Muslims have a natural or cultivated predisposition toward violence, because that's actually in the nature of the religion. So that was going on just a few years ago. And when this came to light, the FBI claimed that they disavowed the material, even though they had been using it to train agents. And they said that it was not reflective of the true values of the FBI. And James Comey, who's the current director of the FBI, has, in just the past 3 months, about 2 or 3 months ago, he wrote an op-ed piece in which he said that he keeps on his desk a photograph of the FBI's letter that was sent to Martin Luther King Jr. to try to get to, it seems to try to encourage him to commit suicide. It said that we know about you, you're an awful, terrible person, you're a hypocrite, you're a pervert, you're the worst kind of human being, and there's only one way to deal with this, and you know what that is. And he said he keeps that on his desk as a reminder of the errors of the FBI and the awful things that they did earlier, so that they can actually try to reform the Bureau. So that sounds like a very sincere commitment to changing things. But if one actually stands back and looks at the kinds of national security practices that have occurred where Muslims have been disappeared, in the early 2000s, after 9/11, the United States actually operated a Muslim registry until Barack Obama took office. And if one looks at the surveillance practices that are going on in mosques, the FBI's efforts to try to conduct terrorist cells where the FBI comes up with terror plots, and then they try to convince Muslims to join these terror plots. And if they convince them to do anything, here are the keys to a truck, we'll pay you $20,000, just park this truck in front of the building. And it has a fake bomb in the back. And then the FBI arrests them and they parade it on the news, we stopped the terrorists, even though they may have spent 3 years trying to convince that person to drive through. a truck and park it in front of a building. If you think about the FBI, if they were to try to get a Christian to drive a truck in front of an abortion clinic, would they be able to do that? Well, probably. If they spent 3 years, I imagine they could probably find some Christians to do that. Most of the violence that's committed throughout the world is not committed by Muslims. Only less than 2% of the violence in Europe, of terrorist acts in Europe, are committed by Muslims. Less than 2%. In other words, more than 98% by people who are not Muslims. United States, similar kind of pattern. Clearly, the claims about national security don't match the reality of the actual violent threats that face our nation and our world. So those are some of the specific things that have happened with the FBI's engagement with American Muslims, including particularly African Americans, but also far beyond that. And what they indicate is that there is an intertwined history of racism and targeting religious groups. I have called that, I'm not the only one, but I've used the language of racializing Islam, governing Muslims as if they are a race, and in the way that I've tried to explain that concept of race, where people are treated, they're subject to the power of a state, but they're treated as if they can never truly belong to that state. And unfortunately, that's where we are, and we can't stay there. We have to change that, but that's where we are.
So, quick thank you for Dr. Johnson. Lot to swallow, take in, absorb, marinate, so appreciate that. For our second guest speaker is Georgia House Representative Scott Holcomb. He was elected in 2010 to represent District 81 and currently serves on the Judiciary, Juvenile Justice, Higher Education, Defense and Veterans Affairs, and Public Safety and Homeland Security Committees. So, quite great. Besides his current position, he has practiced law since 1998 and was a lawyer with the U.S. Army JAG Corps. He deployed overseas 3 times and provided legal advice to the 3-star generals who commanded ground forces during the initial phase of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, Representative Holcomb practices law with Holcomb & Ward, LLP, which he calls a boutique law firm in Atlanta. Please join me in welcoming Representative Scott Holcomb. So within those great career highlights we just mentioned, you also served in Bosnia and helped with the peacemaking effort there. Would you be able to describe the context for the audience, as well as one of the challenges you faced with religion in this reconciliation effort?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for coming out. This is an incredibly important discussion, and I think it's one that we don't have enough in this country. I'll start by just the general framework is that race and religion are central to our domestic politics, and they're central to our foreign policy. With respect to Bosnia, I served there from 2000 to 2001, and many of you may know that they had a horrible civil war from about 1992 until 1995. It was a country that prior to that was the former Yugoslavia, and it broke up through the civil war. And it had a strongman, Tito, who kept the country in balance. And it had 3 different groups. It had Orthodox, it had Muslims, and it had Catholics. And for very long periods of time, they operated without any issues. In fact, many of them probably couldn't tell the difference between each other in terms of religion. But as is often the case, you have leaders who prey upon division, who prey upon hate, who prey upon anger, and they use that to consolidate their own power, and that's what we had during that conflict. So you had an incredibly nasty, violent, in many ways depraved, horrible situation where individuals are just targeted because of their religion. Thousands and thousands of people were killed. religious structures were purposefully targeted, and in terms of the laws of war, for those of you who are interested in that, civilian property is supposed to be off limits, and religious property is supposed to be off limits. Yet those were in many ways the most prominent targets that that were sought after by the commanders. When I arrived in 2000, the conflict had stopped. About 5 years had gone by, and it was primarily stopped by the efforts of our diplomats and conversation that we're having about shrinking our State Department. I think that that's a mistake. And Richard Holbrooke in particular was a prominent statesman, and in Dayton he brought everybody together and they were able to pull together the Dayton Peace Accords. I don't want to dig too much into that, but I do want to mention Richard Holbrooke because he wrote an excellent book about his experience with Bosnia, and the book's title is called Endgame. And on the very first page, he presents the scenario and he postulates, imagine if in the United States, every single radio station and television station were run by the KKK. And imagine what that would do to our society. And he argued that that was effectively what you had happening within that country during the Civil War, is it was the purposeful distribution of hate and anger and fear. So when I arrived, one of the most striking sights was to go through, or to travel down the road and to see one house that was perfectly fine, and then the next house that was destroyed, and then the next house was perfectly fine, and you knew that those outcomes were just because the shooter, his religion was the same as those that was not targeted and was different for those that were destroyed. I had the opportunity to get to meet a number of civilians, as we call them in the military. You have the military and the civilians. And you had the whole range of views and passions, as you would expect. You had those who really could never let the hate go because they were hurt in ways that were really personal. They lost family members. They themselves were subject to the cruelty. And then you had others that could see that the path forward, the only true path forward, was through reconciliation, was through having a dialogue and putting that horrible period behind them and really working to try to create a civil society that was functioning and that was based on respect. One of the hardest things that I had to do was I had to teach a law of war course to former commanders for the three groups that had been fighting. So they still had their militaries that existed, and one of the roles that we played in the peacekeeping phase was to help professionalize them and to build them up. And this may be shocking, but lawyers are not the most popular people in the military, and that's true both in our military and when you deal with other services. But the commander who I worked for, he thought it was important that we have this discussion, and so he said to me, you're going to teach these former commanders about the laws of war. So I go through and I give this presentation, and I'll never forget, because when I finished, and you could tell that they had all fought against each other. They still hated each other, and with not much effort, we could get back into a conflict pretty easily. And one of the first questions that I was asked was, what do you do when the commander that you were fighting against ignored, violated, abused all of the norms, everything that you just talked about, and purposefully killed, murdered, raped, tortured our loved ones? What am I supposed to do? And it was a tough question. I provided an answer and worked my way through it, but it was a very tough question. And these issues, I don't want to go so far as to say never going away, but they're probably never going away. And we need to just find ways that for each situation, we can take the best practices and learn, and then try to, at least for that situation, fix it and cure it. There will be another situation, but I also have the hope that we can and will make progress and positive change.
So let's walk forward to your current role in politics. And so here in Atlanta, you face interesting dynamics of religion and race, especially given today's tension at many levels, like the local, state, regional, national, international. We got all of those here. Would you help bring us into your world by providing an overview of how religious matters are viewed in the Georgia General Assembly?
I'll try.
Yeah.
I'm a Democrat, which may surprise some of you. I'm not the typical profile white male veteran. One might not immediately assume that I'm a Democrat. Most of my colleagues in the Democratic Party are African Americans, and as I started my conversation, race is central to American politics, and it's absolutely central to Southern politics. Most of the members of the General Assembly are Christians. I think there's one Jewish member of the General Assembly. There are probably a few who are agnostic. There are no Muslims. And if you ever want to come and watch us, we only have a few days left for this session. We have a 40-day session. We start at 10 a.m. and we start with a benediction every morning. And I was surprised when I first got sworn in and was a member, because coming from my military background, the chaplains really did a good job of making everybody feel comfortable. And there is a way to do that, because there's a lot of commonality between the major faiths, right? Love people, treat them with kindness, do good things. I know that's really simple, and I admit that, but there's a lot of commonality and common ground that can be found, and there's a way that you can talk to make everybody feel welcome and inclusive. A lot of times the prayers that we hear are not inclusive at all. In fact, sometimes I find them to be quite objectionable, and it's a debate that we have, because do you stand and maybe protest, or do you sit there and recognize that there are different views than yours, and maybe be respectful to the speaker, but not agree with the idea? But sometimes it is a little bit challenging. I will kind of pivot, because I think the role of Islam, I think, is really being sorted out, both in Georgia politics and nationally. These discussions about the ban, all too much misunderstanding and fear and prejudice by many leaders. People who are actually in positions of power don't have the understanding that they need, and that's just a fact. And I don't know how to fix that, but it is a fact, and it's a problem. And I'll just put it out there, because I think it's true. I don't think our president has a very sophisticated understanding of these issues at all. And in fact, in many ways, I think he's going down some pretty dangerous roads, and he doesn't appreciate the second and third order effects of some of what he's doing. ISIS, and I'll switch very quickly to foreign policy and then tie it back to Georgia. ISIS has killed more Muslims than non-Muslims, and they would like nothing more for U.S. domestic policy to be that we marginalize and exclude and make the Muslim community feel like they are not welcome. That is part of their strategic goals, and it's not talked about. It's not talked about enough, and instead we have too many leaders who follow that same path, and I think heighten the challenges and the lack of inclusion that we really need to make progress. This may sound totally trite, and perhaps it is, but all too often in the political space, the right things to do are the hardest things to do, and that's reconciliation, inclusion, promoting diversity. And the easiest things to do, sadly, often yield the most political benefit. And it goes back to some of my experience in Bosnia. It's really easy to prey upon divisions and hate for your own short-term electoral gain. It's a sad truth that I wish that we could change. So within Georgia, Islam is the fastest growing religion, so we are going to have a reckoning soon in terms of having an inclusive atmosphere. But we have a lot of work to do. And I've wondered how an imam might be received if one were to come and give the benediction at the Capitol. And I hate to say it, but I don't think that that person of faith would be welcomed as a person of faith, and there would probably be a lot of prejudice that would be exhibited. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we have a lot of work to do. Through our lives, this is going to be one of the central challenges that we are going to have to face. And those of us who are committed to reconciliation, we need to find ways to engage. We need to find ways to positively change people's views. And we need to relentlessly refute the false counter-narrative, which is all too prevalent in our current political debate.
Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
And now, since I'm the moderator, I get to ask questions that I feel that I get to indulge myself. All right, so let's get some questions that kind of bring some interaction here. Now, so to bring Dr. Johnson back in, and hopefully not to cause tension, but how do you see the history of the national security paradigm, empire, and colonialism that we were talking about earlier within some of the issues and conflicts that Representative Holcomb has discussed?
Yeah, I think that he's given a very really accurate and rich analysis of both the global situation, politics, and much more domestic level, these political formations, because it is very true, unfortunately, that people respond quite vigorously to invocations of hatred, of fear, of rallying the troops against some supposed enemy. And these national security paradigms they play an important role. So again, I don't want to be taken as I'm talking about the problems of these practices, and I'm not saying a lot about the things that are useful about them. So I don't want that to be taken to mean I don't think there is anything useful, but rather that what has become urgent is the extraordinary scale of the abuse of state power at a domestic level, at a global level. And so it is certainly true that that people will typically respond more forcefully to these calls for making a society less inclusive, for targeting some type of scapegoat. I think Scott's point is very true, though. The vast majority of victims of terrorism by terrorist acts, how you define that, is stateless actors, even though states commit acts of terrorism, including the United States. But most of the victims of terrorism at the hands of Muslims are overwhelmingly Muslims. And you would never know that if you were just watching the U.S. news. You would never know that. Our media are interested only in talking about non-Muslims for the most part when they're talking about acts of terrorism. And it's important to understand that, because what Scott was demonstrating is that the policies don't actually square with the reality. It doesn't actually make any sense from a fact-based perspective. And so then there must be some other kind of role that's being played by this response. And so what is that other role? And that other role is definitely propagandistic. It definitely can rally a movement. But unfortunately, everyone suffers, even people who think they're going to benefit from these state practices. And one example of this is the degree to which people who think they have nothing to be afraid of, who say things like, well, I don't have anything to hide, so If we have a state that surveils every email, phone call, text message, fax that gets communicated, that's fine because I don't have anything to hide. Most people who have been classified as enemies of the state were not committing crimes. Being an enemy of the state is a political category. It means that so it's not a criminal category. You don't have to commit any crimes. It means that you are recognized by intelligence authorities as being an obstacle to the best interests of that state. So it's political, and we have a history of something called McCarthyism in this country. Most of the victims of that were white, Protestant, heterosexual Christian men and their families. And that was most of the victims. Most of them weren't Muslims, most of them were not black. And yet they were seen as being a threat, even though they had not committed crimes. We had something in the 1970s called the Church Committee investigation. It was led by Democratic Senator Frank Church. And it was the first time in the history of the United States that any federal body had stood back and investigated the intelligence practices in this country. And what they found is that there were rampant violations of the United States Constitution that had deprived citizens of their rights. And it was around that time, in fact, the years leading up, the early 70s, that what we called COINTELPRO, what the FBI called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, first came to public attention. And what that demonstrated, and one thing that resulted from that was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It was the first time that there was some federal oversight of these intelligence practices. If the people from the 1970s were to, and some of them are still alive, to look at what they created then, which was the first federal accountability for intelligence activity, and they were to look at what we're doing now, where we are now in 2017, they would be amazed, because it's as if we didn't learn anything from the 1970s. I mean, the scale of the state power that is exercised to jeopardize people, whether or not they've done anything, is amazing. And so I think one of the takeaways is that no one should think that they are immune from the kind of threats and challenges that emerge from abuses of state power. One of the important points that I think we should recognize from some recent history of alliances and solidarities and reconciliations is that I think is good news is that many whites have stood up to be part of Black Lives Matter, for example, to say that we need to stop the abuse of state power. Many Christians have spoken out in acts of terror against Muslims to say that this is our country, as in all of us, and in this country we're not going to scapegoat people, and we're not going to terrorize anyone in the name of national security, and we denounce these practices. There was a Wheaton College professor, Larisha Hawkins, who lost her job because she took, I think, an amazing act of solidarity at a Christian institution, a Christian professor who wore a veil to express her solidarity with Muslims, because she said that I am recognizing that these people are my people, that we're all part of this society, that I'm not going to define my Christianity in opposition to someone's Muslimness, that that's not what makes me a Christian. That was her way of trying to assert a type of reconciliation, and unfortunately, she lost her job because of it. So you can read that very tragically, but I also think we can read that very hopefully, that's the kind of act of solidarity that becomes important for really undermining what is otherwise an effective strategy of dividing people.
Ending on positives, that's good. Let's keep that rolling. Representative Holcomb, as a follow-up, and thinking about this longer history that Dr. Johnson's been describing, either ideally or more practically, how can you see maybe a pathway forward for the reconciliation given our context? Either practically or dream.
It needs to be absolutely a top priority of our leadership, and it needs to be frequently stated, and the commitment can't be a minimal one-time iteration. Like, it can't be said in a speech and then nothing else happens. There needs to be a true commitment in terms of having this reconciliation move forward. And if you study what happens in places like Bosnia and other places where really they go to hell, and just it's probably the best kind of description that you can give it. The only way out of that is to get off of the circle of hate. And the only way you can get off the circle of hate is if you can move towards forgiveness. There is certainly a helpful role for faith leaders in that, because a central tenet of religion is reconciliation. My own faith, I'm Catholic. The central premise is that nothing is irredeemable, and that's something that I think about a lot. And so that commitment from leadership, it can't be understated, because it sets the tone and it drives the conversation, and it either pushes wedges or it seeks to eliminate them. And so for all of you, just a couple of practical tips. I would, if that's the future that you want to see and the present that you want to see, get engaged in the political space. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to run, but I would actually encourage people to think about that, especially women. We need more women to be involved in public service. And then if running for office isn't for you, then promote people who have that type of inclusive vision, because it's what we need, and we need a lot more of that. The way our politics works is all you need is one vote more than the other one and you win. But when you get the seat at the table, you get to set the tone. And I am convinced that this argument, this position of wanting to have an inclusive society that's based on reconciliation, because that's the only lasting way to peace, to success, to vibrance. It's the only lasting way. You have to help get leaders there and reward them.
Thanks so much. All right, now this has been great so far. Now we're going to open it up with the audience. If anyone has questions, I'd like to ask the distinguished panel. Oh, sorry.
So I have a question. We're doing all of this in the context of Georgia State University, which is a publicly funded university. What do both of you see as the role of the public university in moving this forward?
So certainly, to begin with, what I hope is an obvious example, fostering these kinds of settings where people can actually come together and develop some sense of alliance, discuss these issues. I think that the universities have a major role to play, since they are doing research and teaching. That's core to their mission. Certainly requiring, I think, if we believe that this is really important, if it's actually vital to having a functioning society, one that does not end in the destruction of civil liberties and human life, that students need to be required to actually engage with some of these larger, difficult issues. And at a time and an environment, and I was a STEM undergraduate major. I majored in chemistry and loved science and never stopped enjoying it, even though I teach in the humanities now. But in an era when STEM is really creating, universities are devoting lots of resources to STEM and saying, well, the humanities stuff, okay, you can take a class or two in the humanities, but we really want you to go the STEM route. This is the moment to say, you know what, we're not going to have a human society if we don't require people who are educated in our universities to cultivate a level of intellectual sophistication in tackling some of these larger issues. And so that, I think that means that in some kind of way it should be flexible, but this is the core mission of universities, that we actually have to require students to study issues that are at the center of our most difficult challenges in the areas of religion and race. We have to take that seriously, and if we reach the point where we can begin to act as if we understand that creating policies, that sustaining movements, that structuring our social engineering is as essential to our human future as curing cancer or engineering more efficient and cleaner sources of energy. When we reach that point, I think that the humanities will be in a better place. I think that, at least in theory, our students will have been required to engage with a level of sophistication that they can then choose to take into their work and to go into different domains, whatever that work may be. So that's core to the mission. I think there are many other things that could happen, but that would seem to be at least one important strategy among others that should be in place.
Yeah, I agree with all of that completely. And in the United States, we have a very long history and proud history of our educational system being not just to learn a trade or an occupation, but that it's central to having informed, engaged citizens. And since I think there is a lot of agreement that the issues that we've talked about are the challenge and will continue to be the challenge, having a focus and a requirement, I would absolutely support and think that would be very helpful and productive to this dialogue. And for the students, what I would encourage you to do, and I regret I didn't do enough of this when I was a student, I do a lot of it now, is to really get outside your comfort zone. If you don't know much about those with different faiths, get to know it. It's fascinating, and you will find, I think, that you will find much more common ground than differences, and the conversations will be really enriching. So you could both learn more about a different faith, but also hopefully create some very good friendships, which there's a lot of value in that too.
Thank you very much. It's a kind of two-pronged question. Referring to Yugoslavia and Bosnia, the International Court of Justice is, I think, still persecuting some war criminals. Do you think that works? And then compare that process to what happened in South Africa with the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, where people confess to their wrongdoings, their sins, and I assume were allowed to proceed with their lives. I think of this young woman, Amy, I think that was her name, the Peace Corps worker who was murdered in one of the townships, and subsequently one of her killers confessed to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So what I'm trying to figure out is which is the way to go, to hold people personally accountable, which I don't think works in this country anyhow, or the South African route, which seemed to talk about communal exchange of crimes committed and communal forgiveness. I don't know if I'm making sense there.
Yeah, you are. I think they're both valuable, and they serve different roles. The International Court of Justice helps provides a forum to make sure that there's a global sense or a global consensus in terms of what's within the boundaries and what's out of it, and to hold those accountable who do go outside of international law and commit these terrible atrocities. So I think that there's value there in terms of foreign policy and international relations, of providing a mechanism by which those who are horrible violators of human rights and international law, that they will be held accountable. It's not perfect, for sure. I don't think there's anything in the public space that is, but I think that it has value, and I certainly support keeping it going. In terms of the reconciliation, I think that that's much more for a domestic audience, and that helps with the existing civil society to really overcome whatever the tragedy or crisis was that they experienced. So on an individual level, they can have healing and move forward. And I am impressed by the model out of South Africa and other places on the continent where I think they've done a good job with this. And it comes back to my answer on the other question of that committed, sustained leadership is critical to having the opportunity to have these very difficult conversations, and to set the tone within society that this is the right thing to do, and to make it a priority, and to stress its importance in terms of moving forward.
Thank you both again. If I could just ask for an example from either one of you or both of you, if possible, of a case in which you've seen in this country, let's say in the last 15 to 20 years, where the same political makeup, the kind of spectrum that we're seeing now that's extremely divided, where you've seen an instance of communities being forced to come together, redress wrongs, make some progress towards reconciliation, and seeing something that actually works, that's crossing a political divide, especially around issues of policing and those long historical, antagonisms. I think we're all on the same page about the necessity to go there. The question is the roadmap and the how-to. I'm quite sure that we've got examples in this country, maybe not that recent, but at some point where we've done it. And what can we point to in a time like now to say this might work?
So my brother-in-law is here, Aaron Nicholson. He's actually done this kind of work. I'm tempted to. He's looking around as if he's not. And we've had a couple of many conversations about this. But Aaron, would you share some examples of, because this type of thing has been going on here in Atlanta, particularly around community policing, reconciliation, community police relations? Because I think you could certainly speak to this better than I can. I'm trying to come up with a crystal example, but you've already told me about one or two.
Yeah, thank you guys for being here, and thank you for announcing that I was here. So, and I can only speak to the Atlanta Police Department. I work for the Atlanta Police Foundation, and one of my goals is working along with the Community Policing Initiative with the Atlanta Police Department. And APD has, over the past few years, have several initiatives where they are trying to get out in the community as far as really feel the temperature of the community and what is needed with the community, instead of constantly going in and saying, this is what is needed, this is what we feel. Prime example, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the area of English Avenue, Vine City, formerly called The Bluff, but probably one of the biggest open-air heroin markets in the Southeast. And currently, we've had situations where we're constantly locking our youth up over there. So one thing our past Chief Turner wanted to do was open a diversion center. So it's giving the officers the actual discretion on the street, instead of locking up a youth, being able to bring them into some sort of treatment center. So instead of trying to break that cycle of actual kind of getting it in that penitentiary. So Atlanta Police and other police departments across the nation are really realizing that community policing is an important part of what we're doing. And actually, the Justice Department was down here this week looking at Atlanta Police Department as a community policing model for the nation. So there are things going slowly, I'm not saying that they're constantly occurring every day, but definitely are people within these individual departments that want to see some sort of change. I do have a question, though. When you talk about the war on the terror war on terror, it reminds me of the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s. And can either one of you speak on how that is? There's a close correlation between both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the relationship is a very strong one. And one of the things that I've written about with respect to the 60s and 70s is that and this is going to be another negative example of the FBI's activity, but I'm not going to keep repeating ad nauseum my earlier disclaimer. But one of the things that happened during the 60s is that the FBI had long been forming itself as a central nervous system of sorts among police departments. And the Bureau militarized police departments. So that meant that police departments got something that we now take for granted. It's called SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics. And that began as an effort to destroy what the FBI called black militants, who by 1967 the FBI considered what it called the Negro Rebellion to be the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. It even exceeded communism, according to the FBI's director, J. Edgar Hoover, by 1967. And if you have any sense of the history of anti-communism in the United States, you can appreciate the gravity of saying something like that. And so it militarized the police, weaponry, tactics. Police departments became intelligence organizations. So now every police department in the United States is an intelligence organization. Every police department has counterintelligence. Every police department has military weapons. And when I say militarized, what I mean is that these are actually military installations. Okay? If we think that there's military over here and militarized over there, I don't think that accurately represents what's going on. There are still some other important differences about jurisdictions, et cetera. But what the Church Committee recognized and put in writing in its reports in the 1970s is that this intelligence activity and this militarizing activity had caused the police departments, and this was the 70s, as this war on drugs was just beginning to take off, had actually shifted policing so that police were engaging citizens under a paradigm of engaging enemies on a foreign field. And that was a qualitative difference. And the Church Committee recognized that distinction was beginning to happen. And when people are perceived as enemies, there are real problems. And so you can speak to this even, I think, more richly than I can, that there are lots of crossovers. So there are times when military activity is doing policing activity, where it's community, you're trying to keep peace, you're trying to maintain peace. And doing some things that we associate with traditional policing. And there are times when police departments are doing that, and there are times when police departments are doing things that we see as really being more of, these are enemies and we're going to war against them. And so we have our weapons and we're going to engage everyone as a threat. And so, but that was a qualitative shift. And the relationship to the war on terror lies in the fact that this is a military paradigm. It relies on understanding of a threat as something that is a kind of ultimate enemy. Right? So no one wants to, the presumption is that you don't negotiate with terrorists, because it's almost like trying to have a conversation with a monster. It's what you think you're dealing with is so far beyond the pale of humanity that your aim is not reconciliation. First, your aim is to destroy this, and so you see that in the war on terror. It's as if we're not even dealing with human beings anymore. We're dealing with unlogical evil. That becomes the order of the scenario. And many experts within and outside of the U.S. who have looked at U.S. drug policies have observed something similar about what came to be called the war on drugs, that it targeted very specific populations, mostly poor, black or Hispanic. So if you're wealthy and a drug user, and especially if you're white, you have a far greater chance of not being shot or killed by police. In fact, in the Northeast right now, if you're a heroin addict, you can literally walk into a police department and they will take you to a treatment. You can have the needle in your hand when you walk in, and they will take you to drug treatment. And instead of arresting you and incarcerating you. And with this war on drugs, it came to the point of recognizing that these populations should have been treated as people who were good candidates for rehabilitation, but instead the object is to incarcerate and to criminalize. And what that tells us is a distinction between thinking you can reach out and incorporate people into the society as opposed to trying to get rid of them. So those are some of the ways in which there are real parallels there. And another parallel is that both of these activities have been heavily monetized. So there's a recent documentary by Ava DuVernay called 13th, and it's looking at the history of incarceration and criminalization by thinking about several different institutional practices. But one of those things is the amount of money that flowed because of increasing incarceration. It's not that everyone is so full of fury and hate that they're not thinking. There's fury and there's hate, but there is also thinking and calculation going on too. And mass incarceration has been very profitable. The war on terror is driving a lot of the military activity of the United States right now. Were it not for that, our theaters of militarism would be far fewer and the scale would be lower. And so these are highly profitable opportunities to sell new technologies, to develop new weaponry. I'm not against developing technology or weaponry. We need those things. But the politics matters. Just recently, Chicago settled a reparations suit because the city had been operating a black site since the 1970s until about 2012 that was devoted to targeting and disappearing and torturing and sometimes killing Black and Hispanic men who supposedly were involved in gangs and drug use. That was put into effect because of the war on drugs. And we don't know how many other black sites there are. So this was not Guantanamo Bay. The people who were being detained were not some foreigners. These were people who lived in Chicago. These were U.S. citizens. And because they were held incommunicado, they were not allowed to have contact with attorneys. They were not allowed to contact their families, and at times they were killed. They were always tortured and detained. It was so bad, the city did something that is very unusual. They actually settled a reparations suit. That has very clear contours with the kinds of torture and black sites that have arisen through the war on terror.
Representative Holcomb, going back to examples of the last couple decades or so?
I can't think of any recent ones, but certainly the civil rights movement itself is a shining example of how to bring about really incredible change. And the use of nonviolence as a political tool and standing incredibly strong on the values and clearly defining the values and linking those values in a very universal way, I think was incredibly successful, and there's some lessons that can be drawn from that. And to tie that with a little personal anecdote, one of the privileges of being able to serve in the Georgia House, which hasn't always made the best history, we're trying, is that I've been able to serve with members who were contemporaries with Dr. King. And they knew him, they worked with him, they spent time with him, and he couldn't even really come into the building during his lifetime, and we now honor him with a painting. We'll soon have a statue, and then the movie Selma, if you all have seen it, if you haven't, then watch it. At the end, where LBJ is speaking to what's supposed to be a joint session of Congress, that's actually the Georgia House that was filmed in the Georgia Capitol. So I share that just to add some positive aspect to this is that, to use an MLK quote of the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, it actually does bend. It's slow, but it actually does bend, and things can get better, but we need that common theme of leadership and commitment to making it better.
Thank you. I am now reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and if you have not read it, I recommend it to you. But I've just finished reading Coretta Scott King's My Life, My Love, My Legacy, as told to Dr. Barbara Reynolds, and both of them speak to the issues that you were talking about. One of the things that bothers me, and I've lived a long, long, long time, you can tell by looking at me, one of the things that bothers me, and that I addressed in my last book, I've written 5 of them now, was the the way the young black men were being killed by police. And my dad had done such a great job of protecting the 9 of us. And I grew up in Moultrie, Georgia. And I wanted my family to know about that. But it bothers me that we don't know our history. History, and I'm an educator, history is the poorest taught subject in our education system. If we knew the true history of America, we would know that there are only 2 groups here who are not immigrants. They are the ones who were here when Columbus discovered America. We call them Native Americans, and the African Americans who were brought here to build this country on their backs without the benefit of minimum wage. What bothers me the most is that especially my people don't know their history. And I want them to know it because I think knowing it might get some action.
Any shout-outs for history?
I just want to echo that is such an important point to make. It's really sad that given all of the publishing and scholarship that's been done on Africana history now, that the general level of awareness is so poor. I want to make a related point that is not at all in disagreement. It's affirming what you're saying. I would say something else too, and that is we need to do a better job of teaching the history of whiteness in this country. I'm struck by the fact that so many white Americans have been convinced to be very content and to feel very safe, that their whiteness will protect them from state power. Ask any European to talk to you about what they call fascism, and they can talk to you about how whiteness did not protect them from all kinds of things. But this country even, is this the same country that created a eugenics movement for white people? It didn't create that because they already had stuff for black people and indigenous people. It created a eugenics movement for white people. And one of the things that my new research has turned to examining is artificial intelligence, human-machine relations, intelligent machines. And one of the there are exciting things about it, medical applications. One of the things that's troubling about it is the possibility of massive disemployment of high cognitive labor, of highly skilled labor. So think of your doctors, attorneys, financial analysts, people who make millions of dollars a year, rapidly being disemployed. We have built out a carceral system that is the most elaborate in the world. We incarcerate more people at a higher rate than anyone else. And that's mostly black and brown people. But what's coming is a huge threat to white Americans who have been made to feel very secure and who have a history in this country of being victims of racism, actually, of state practices. And I don't think we do enough job of actually teaching that, because so many people feel so comfortable, instead of realizing that everyone, that no one can afford to be very vigilant about issues of justice, of civil liberties, of building alliances, of solidarities. And what's about to hit the fan is going to put us in a very different place. If we don't change our paradigms, if we don't enact the kinds of things that, and I loved your invitation for people, get involved in politics. You know, we need to stop being cynical. We need to start getting involved, is a really important invitation. Because if we don't change what we have, the paradigms and the institutions and the structures, if we don't stop investing in the criminalization and the categorizing that we've been doing, we're going to be very shocked at how quickly things get so much worse than they already are. So it is urgent that we have reconciliations, that we have these alliances.
Representative Holcomb, any final concluding thoughts?
Yes, if you want to be really cynical about politics, you could argue that there are those who achieve power and keep it by keeping people uninformed about history, alternative facts, all those kinds of things. And I think, to echo a little bit about what Dr. Johnson just talked about, one of the things that I think about a lot outside of this subject, but I think that there is a little bit of a tie, is how we're going to employ people 10, 20, 30 years. I think that's going to be one of the central challenges that we have. Globalization is a part of it, but it's really much more the automation, and you have the investment of capital, and then that capital can do things that all of us can do today, but machines are going to be able to do going forward. That's going to be an incredible challenge of how it works through, and we're not talking about enough, and we're not really prepared for it. But what I worry about with that is you hear it a little bit that we just need to focus on skills and training, and that almost singular myopic focus on training for jobs. But when we do that, when we miss the liberal arts in its broad span, you lose so much, both in terms of just overall understanding that we need as members and participants in civil society, and then just for the arts themselves, all the originality and creativity that stems from that. So we have a lot of conversations on our plate and a lot of answers that we need to figure out. But I think we had a good discussion today, and I'm very proud to be part of it.
And for concluding, we'd like to invite up to the microphone our chair for our department, Dr. Catherine McClellan.
Well, like everyone else here, I just want to thank you both, all of you, for a really rich conversation. The question is where we go now. I want to encourage you to challenge the paradigm, and to challenge the paradigm along with us in the Department of Religious Studies. There's a lot going on in the department. If you want to learn more, we've got a table full of literature here, and lots of people eager to talk with you about where we go from here, so the conversation doesn't end here today. But I want to take a minute just to thank everyone who helped make this evening happen. First of all, of course, our guests, Dr. Sylvester Johnson and Representative Scott Holcomb. Thank you very much. I want to thank the faculty members who put this together, Dr. Abbas Barzagar, Dr. Monique Moultrie, and Dr. Brett Asaki. And as always, the backbone of our organization, Ms. Claire Murata Coy and Ms. Felicia Thomas, who helped make all of this just appear in front of us. So thank you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Great.